welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, covering the new coronavirus, this CCP virus, with our 5-day-a-week broadcast Monday through Friday. We have a great lineup today. We're going to be starting off with leaked documents from China. We're going to be going into how the Chinese regime is using the virus to expand its information control and surveillance. Then we're going to be going into some stories about how U.S. taxpayer money was being sent to this controversial laboratory in Wuhan. And then we're going to be going into as well U.S. universities being investigated for their ties again to that laboratory in Wuhan. So now before we get started, folks, if you haven't already, please do remember to like and subscribe. Also click that notification bell. You get alerts when our new videos are up. Now folks, some of you have been asking how you can support this channel and also what you can do to stand up against some of the disturbing things we're discussing here pretty regularly. Now, when it comes to the Chinese regime, the Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, rejection, and condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you can, please go there now, sign the petition. It's ccpvirustruth.com. That's ccpvirustruth.com. And if you can, let everybody know about it. Everyone you know, let them know about it. And folks, if you want to help support this channel, we do accept donations. And again, we really appreciate the support you've given. And even then, just like and subscribe. Again, it means a lot to us. It really helps us grow. The CCP is using the virus to expand its information controls and surveillance. Now, the Epoch Times has received another leaked document from within the Chinese regime. This one shows how the regime is expanding its systems for monitoring and social controls. And this document specifically is from Dalian, from the Dalian City Comprehensive Treatment Center. It shows the CCP is increasing its totalitarian controls amid the virus, including through the use of big data and surveillance. And there's an article from Epoch Times states, quote, "In the document, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, requested that the District Committee, Political and Legal Committee, together with the Publicity and Public Security Departments, conduct disposal, public opinion guidance, and social management, and continue to conduct 24-hour online inspections focusing on discovering and handling epidemics-related rumors and various inappropriate comments to prevent the escalation of negative public opinion hype." In other words, the Chinese regime has expanded its monitoring programs to a 24-hour system of online inspection, where they're looking for information about the epidemic and any, quote, rumors that may be spread about it. And in China, under the Chinese regime, rumors is a loaded term. It's a politicized term. It means anything outside of the Chinese regime's narratives. What they're referring to is anything that could challenge the interests of the regime, such as criticisms against the regime, or saying the Chinese regime did not handle the management of the outbreak properly, or people complaining about the Chinese regime. Any of these could fall under that. And it says this is to prevent the escalation of negative public opinion. It means that if the regime were to allow the free discourse, the free spread of information, it fears what that may mean for its holds on power. Now, this is a totalitarian regime that controls every bit of information that can be spread. And why does it do that? The Chinese Communist Party is afraid of the truth, because if it were allowed for information to spread, it fears that would be a threat to its national security, to public security, public stability. And so for the regime, the management of information, the prevention of information that goes against its interests from spreading, these types of things are about maintaining control and nothing else. So the fact that the Chinese regime is expanding these programs right now suggests two things. One, that the regime fears what the Chinese people may be discussing, because any sentiments against the Chinese regime and its handling of the virus could be something people relate to. In other words, if people see information like that, they could turn more and more against the Chinese regime, and this could be a threat to its stability and power. It also means the Chinese regime very likely is not secure about the truth of the situation. It is insecure about the truth of the situation. And moving on, ABC Australia is reporting the coronavirus is giving Beijing cover to extinguish Hong Kong's democracy. Now, we all, I'm sure, remember the Hong Kong protests, which were going full force, about 2 million people at its height protesting on the streets in a country of about 7 million people. And of course, what has happened now that this virus outbreak has taken place? Hong Kong is now under martial law, and they have used this virus. The Hong Kong government, of course, under very likely the auspices of the Chinese Communist Party in the mainland, is using this virus, it appears, to forbid people from protesting on the street because it violates the standards of martial law. About 4.5 hours from China's coronavirus epicenter of Wuhan by high-speed train, recorded its first cases on January 22nd and declared a state of emergency a few days later on January 25th. Since late March, nobody in the former British colony has been allowed to gather in groups larger than 4. While non-essential businesses, including cabs, bars, karaoke parlors, gyms, and cinemas, have been closed to halt the virus's spread. Again, honestly, not too much different from what we're seeing in a lot of places. But in Hong Kong, this has special significance because people who were protesting against the Chinese regime's encroachment into Hong Kong were, of course, out on the streets in very large numbers and having very, I'd say, serious clashes with authorities there. The Epoch Times had, of course, a lot of reporters on the ground when this was happening. And notably, given our reporting, our printing press in Hong Kong was firebombed. It means that the Chinese regime could very likely be using the virus to implement the various systems of control that it wanted to implement without having the risk of, say, public backlash. It is possible that they could implement these things during this time while the people cannot go out and protest. There's also the question of how long can the regime keep Hong Kong on lockdown? How long can they keep it like this? They could say it's indefinite, but if they wanted to. They could say, okay, no protests allowed on the street ever again because it's a threat to national security because we fear a second wave outbreak. They could easily say that. Now, this is, of course, analysis, some speculation, and so we'll have to see how the situation unfolds. Now, moving on to the next, U.S. taxpayer money has been going to this Wuhan laboratory, this one that's currently being investigated as a possible source of this virus. Keep in mind, folks, saying it came from one of these virus research laboratories does not necessarily mean man-made. It could be, it could not be. They had plenty of natural viruses at these labs. I believe this Dr. Shi Zhengli alone, who is one of the main figures in these investigations now, collected something like 1,500 different coronaviruses. She was called the Batwoman of China. And lo and behold, American taxpayer money was being sent to that laboratory. And there were both defense and research programs being done. Starting off, the National Institute of Health abruptly cuts coronavirus research funding, alarming scientists. Researchers expressed alarm this week after the National Institutes of Health abruptly canceled funding for a long-standing research project by U.S. and Chinese scientists to examine how coronaviruses leap from bats to humans, potentially causing devastating pandemics such as the one we are currently experiencing by a coronavirus genetically linked to those found in bats. Now, you notice here it doesn't say that these were scientists specifically tied to the laboratory that's currently being investigated as a possible source of this virus. It continues, quote, "The NIH has not provided a clear explanation for its move to cancel the funds, which occurred April 24 and was first reported by Politico Monday, April 27th. However, in email exchanges published April 30 by Science magazine, it is clear that the NIH was motivated by conspiracy theories that allege, without evidence, that the virus was somehow released by Chinese researchers in Wuhan, the central Chinese city where the pandemic began." Now, notably, it's still not talking directly about what this, where these Chinese scientists were. It's now going into a little bit about this. The grant that is now going unfunded is titled, quote, "Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence," end quote. And continuing what Ars Technica said, continues. And it was written by EcoHealth Alliance, Inc., a nonprofit based in New York that collaborates with a leading Chinese researcher who studies bat coronaviruses in Wuhan. Doesn't say who this person was, and just wait for it. Continues, the NIH initially funded the work in 2014, providing $3.1 million for 5 years. The NIH then renewed the grant in 2019 after the work received an outstanding peer review score, according to Science. And then it says, quote, the magazine reported that $599,000 of the initial grant money went to Shi Zhengli, a virologist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who collaborates with EcoHealth. So you would have had to have read pretty far into the story to see what it was actually talking about. Shi Zhengli, the bat, this bat woman of China, this #1 researcher on these bat coronaviruses, currently being investigated as a central figure in the possible accidental or intentional release of this virus. And lo and behold, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, again being investigated right now as the possible source of this virus, and the Chinese regime is forbidding external researchers from going in and trying to investigate this, even attacking countries like Australia for calling for these investigations. You would have had to have read almost to the bottom of the article to get that. And it says that they have been collaborating with EcoHealth, and this NIH program was financing this research. There's a bit more happening with this company now, EcoHealth. Now, Breitbart reported, quote, Representative Guy Reschenthaler is investigating a multi-million-dollar Pentagon biological warfare research grant that went to a New York firm that sent taxpayer money to a lab in Wuhan, China, from which U.S. intelligence officials believe the COVID-19 coronavirus, which is plaguing the world, may have leaked. And so here again, this is a different story, but tying to the same central figures. This is a Pentagon biological warfare research grant that went to this laboratory in Wuhan. And now let's continue with what Breitbart's reporting. It says, quote, it's disgusting. Hard-working U.S. taxpayer dollars were sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. President Trump was absolutely correct to freeze that funding from the National Institute of Health. Reschenthaler said in a statement provided exclusively to Breitbart News, and it continues, quote, to learn a $6.5 million Department of Defense grant was awarded to the same organization that sent U.S. taxpayer dollars to the WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, EcoHealth Alliance, is deeply concerning. I sent this letter to the DoD because we must get to the bottom of whether DoD, Department of Defense, grant funding was also sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the potential epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. Given the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up of the origins and the global threat posed by COVID-19, it is critical we ensure taxpayer dollars are not being used to support their activities. Seems another grant allegedly tied to a biological warfare program went to this EcoHealth Alliance, which is apparently working very closely with this Dr. Shi and with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. New York Post reported, quote, Dr. Fauci backed funding for controversial Wuhan lab studying origin of coronavirus. Dr. Anthony Fauci, a member of the coronavirus task force, had previously backed funding for a controversial lab in Wuhan, China, that has been studying the coronavirus in bats, reports said. Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases had shelled out a total of $7.4 million to the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab. So this is a different one. This is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases giving $7.4 million. And another interesting piece to this, after it comes out that Dr. Anthony Fauci backed funding to this Wuhan lab, Newsweek reports, quote, Dr. Fauci dismisses Wuhan lab as source of coronavirus, contradicting Trump and Pompeo. So in other words, while Trump and Pompeo, Secretary of State, are calling out this laboratory as the very likely, according to them, source of this virus, Fauci is coming out and dismissing such claims. And of course, he apparently has had direct ties to this laboratory through his organization. Now let's tie this together now. NIH, Pentagon, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, all having different programs financing research to this laboratory, either directly or indirectly. A New York company tied to them called EcoHealth Alliance, and also ties with that, with the EcoHealth Alliance company, to this Dr. Shi Zhengli. And so it seems that this thing is getting a bit more complex. In a certain regard, though, when it comes to investigating this laboratory, my personal analysis, this is not going to be just about the possibility that the virus leaked from this laboratory at this point. This could very easily turn into a corruption probe. This could very easily turn into, say, a probe into why were they financing research programs at this Chinese lab specifically. Why not a country that has better security protocols? Because, of course, as Washington Post previously reported, there were State Department cables warning that that laboratory, the Wuhan laboratory, the P4 lab, was not secure, that there were security issues, that there was concerns about this. And of course, the Chinese regime has a pretty bad record when it comes to lab leaks. SARS has gotten out of Chinese labs before. This is documented. Looking at some of these different narratives, one of the big things that these different outlets are saying is that they're saying that suggesting the virus came from this lab means it was man-made, and they're saying this is, they're saying anything pointing to the virus coming from this lab, conspiracy theory, based on the fact that they're saying through different channels that there's no evidence that this is man-made. Now, this is a play on words. Saying the virus came from this laboratory does not mean man-made necessarily. They had more than 1,500 bat coronaviruses at this lab, known through this Dr. Shi Zhengli's team. And so it could have easily been a natural virus. And so there's a lot of plays on words, there's a lot of disinformation working here. Now, according to sources I've spoken with, one of the reasons why a lot of different researchers, a lot of different institutions like to work with Chinese laboratories, not necessarily just on viruses, but in general, when it comes to scientific research, is because the Chinese regime does not have the same protocols, the same laws as the rest of the world does. You may remember this Chinese scientist who came out and wrote about how he altered the human genome. He was researching, I believe it was HIV. You can do stuff like that in China. Of course, he was called out by the Chinese regime afterwards, not necessarily because he did that research, but because he created such bad press for the Chinese regime. In China, you can do a lot of research that is illegal in the United States, such as, for example, these programs to increase the virality of viruses, which the Obama administration actually shut down some programs on that, going back 2014, 2015. Notably, one of the programs they shut down ended up being tied to this Dr. Shi Zhengli, the one that these programs are tied to as well. Why was this allowed to happen? Moving on, American universities, U.S. universities, are currently being investigated for ties to this Wuhan laboratory and to the CCP. So a lot today actually tied to this Wuhan laboratory. Starting off from International Business Times. As a headline, U.S. investigating University of Texas's links with controversial Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. The U.S. Department of Education has started an investigation on the links between America's University of Texas and the Chinese lab. On April 24, Reed Rubenstein, the Education Department's acting general counsel, has sent a 7-page letter to Chancellor James Milliken. In the letter, the authorities asked about the tie between the university and the lab, as well as other Chinese entities such as telecom giant Huawei. So where does Huawei tie into this? This is getting interesting. Continues. As reported by the Wall Street Journal, the Education Department is seeking information on any interaction between Galveston National Laboratory, which comes under the University of Texas Medical Branch, and China's Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is owned by the Chinese government's Chinese Academy of Sciences. The Education Department had also asked in the letter about the school's connections with Huawei, the 5G equipment maker, which has been blacklisted by the Department of Commerce. How does Huawei fit into this? This is interesting. Now continuing, quote, as per the U.S. authority, UT reported 10 contracts with Huawei and 24 contracts with state-run universities between 2014 and 2019, totaling around $13 million. The Education Department also asked UT to reveal the details about any gifts received from the Wuhan lab. Chinese companies or individuals such as Zoom CEO Eric Yuan. So what does Zoom have to do with this? Or is this just reporting by IB Times? It's not clear, actually. The U.S. government asked the institute to hand over any details on Wuhan lab researcher Shi Zhengli, who is known as Batwoman for her years of work with bats and bat coronaviruses. So this is also a probe directly naming Shi Zhengli and naming this Wuhan Institute of Virology. I'll go over a couple more stories and then tie them together and then give my analysis at the end. Because the part about receiving gifts, whether the university or individuals there received gifts, this is actually very important. U.S. News had reported, quote, an Education Department investigation triggered schools to report $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed gifts from foreign countries. Not all of these were China. Some included Qatar, some included other countries. China did appear to be the largest. Bloomberg reported at the time, quote, about 115 colleges got monetary gifts, contracts, or both from sources in mainland China in the 6.5 years through June, according to a Bloomberg analysis of U.S. government data. The leader was Harvard University, which pulled in $93.7 million, the majority as gifts. The University of Southern California and University of Pennsylvania were second and third. Remember, all of this took place in the backdrop of this Harvard professor, Charles Lieber, who was head of the chemistry department, who was receiving these quote-unquote gifts and was part of, allegedly, the Chinese regime's Thousand Talents program. It was receiving something like $50,000 a month from the Chinese regime. Notably, he was working on nanobiotechnology. One of the individuals charged alongside him was a Chinese individual who was tied to the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military. The other person was allegedly arrested, or at least charged, while trying to transfer something like 21 vials of an unknown biological substance. So, very interesting case, opening up the can of worms of Chinese regime influence at universities. And this one now, again, going after the University of Texas, looking specifically into Shi Zhengli, this Batwoman of China, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a main figure and main location being investigated as a source of this virus. So this is going to be pretty interesting. This is from Newsweek. The China spy scandal that entangled Harvard could hit Yale and MIT next. Federal law enforcement sources tell Newsweek that last month's arrest of Charles Lieber, the chair of Harvard University's Chemistry and Chemistry Biology Department, is just the, quote, first domino to fall. Federal investigations are targeting what they say is, quote, multiple scientists and researchers at leading universities who have allegedly been enriching their bank accounts by endangering intellectual property paid for by grant monies from the U.S. Department of Defense and National Institutes of Health. And so familiar figures, familiar names, familiar departments all coming up within this very big picture that's unfolding. What we're seeing right now may not, it very likely could uncover some of the research programs that were going to this Wuhan Institute of Virology. When it comes to proving whether that institute is in fact the source of the virus, I don't know how they're going to prove that unless they can get in there. And I don't think China's going to let anybody in there. But what appears to be happening, regardless of that, is they're going after all the individuals on the periphery. When you're dealing with any kind of federal case or major case, they will of course go after all the individuals tied to something along the periphery. So if you're going after, say, a mob boss, you won't go directly after the mob boss, very likely. You're going to go for the guys on the lowest level you can reach, arrest them, get them to testify against the next layer up, get them to testify against the next layer up, and so on, until you have a case against the one you're actually going for. It appears right now that the U.S. government is going after all these grants, all these programs along the periphery, and targeting specifically, as Newsweek reports, multiple scientists and researchers at leading universities who may have been getting money through these grants. Unclear whether they're going to go directly after them or whether these individuals who are found to have taken money, and notably, as it came out recently, $6.5 billion in previously undisclosed gifts from foreign countries were going to America's universities and schools. It does appear something very big is going on, and it appears at least some of it is tied to the research on Xi Zhengli specifically, tied to this Wuhan Institute of Virology specifically, but also tied into a broader picture of the Chinese regime possibly buying off researchers, and specifically U.S. Department of Defense and National Institute of Health grants and programs going to American universities, which the Chinese regime may have been using money and bribes, bribes of course, to gain benefit from. Very interesting scene unfolding right now. And a couple stories on the periphery right now. One, there's a story from CNS News. With strong U.S. backing, Taiwan asks to take part in upcoming WHO assembly. Taiwan News is reporting, quote, Taiwan says WHO should, quote, free itself from China's control. The Chinese regime, of course, does not want Taiwan to be recognized as a legitimate independent country. It calls Taiwan China's Taiwan. Keep in mind that Taiwan used to be recognized as the official government of China. The United Nations was the first to break from that. The U.S. later followed. Taiwan is still, technically, an independent nation, but it is not being allowed into a lot of these international organizations, such as the WHO, and it is believed that the Chinese regime is the one putting pressure on them to not allow them entry, because doing so would validate Taiwan as an independent country. First of all, the U.S. is backing Taiwan and asking to take part in the upcoming WHO assembly, and that Taiwan chose to use the line that the WHO should, quote, free itself from, end quote, China's control. This is checkmate on showing whether the WHO is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. If the WHO allows Taiwan into these meetings, it will legitimize Taiwan and very much anger the Chinese regime. If it refuses to allow Taiwan into it, and Taiwan's actually been playing a pretty major role when it's come to fighting this virus and providing, trust and actual functioning medical equipment to a lot of the world, and has also been issuing reports such as showing that it warned, actually, the WHO of human-to-human transmission when this was not yet being made public, of this virus. But now it's on the WHO to decide. Does it side with China, or does it side with Taiwan and the rest of the world? If it chooses to allow, Taiwan in, China's regime will be very angry. If it chooses to reject Taiwan, it will show the world that the WHO is under the control of the Chinese regime, because only the Chinese regime does not want Taiwan to be legitimized. Interesting story. Pitt researcher studying coronavirus killed in suspected murder-suicide in Ross Township. Bing Liu was on the verge of making very significant findings in a SARS-CoV-2 research project at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, there are no details on why Mr. Bing Liu was killed by this individual, who then apparently killed himself, but they did apparently know each other. It is interesting in two ways. One is, what were the very significant findings he was working on when it comes to this SARS-CoV-2 virus? Two, who exactly was Bing Liu? And three, who was this individual who killed him? Not to mention, why did this individual choose to kill himself afterwards? I don't want to speculate too much because we don't really have many answers on this yet. And so again, more questions, things we don't have answers to yet, but I will keep an eye on this. We will be keeping an eye on this. Now folks, that said, again, really appreciate your support. Some of you have again asked how you can support this channel and also what you can do when facing some of these pretty serious issues that we do cover here. First of all, the Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, condemnation, and rejection of the Chinese Communist Party. And so if you want to take a stand, go to ccpvirustruth.com, sign the petition, let other people know about it. Again, this channel also does take donations if you want to support us. We really appreciate it. And of course, folks, like and subscribe. It helps us, helps build this channel up. We do need your support. That said, again, we'll be broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. So tune in again tomorrow. And of course, stay healthy, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.